All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, my name is Gary McNeil. I'm the Communications Director for EPA's Combined Heat and Power Partnership. Welcome to the webinar. Thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us. Give the next slide, please. As you can see from this slide, reciprocating internal combustion engines, we'll be referring to them as RICE today, are over half of the CHP prime movers currently in operation. We have learned from our stakeholders that there's a high level of interest in EPA's regulations covering these engines. I also want to thank my EPA colleagues who will be making today's presentations, and I'll be introducing them one by one later. We have Roy Crystal, Melanie King, and Susan Lancy. Next slide. And so today we'll be starting out, Roy Crystal, who's from EPA's Region 1, will be talking about how EPA air quality regulations affect combined heat and power facilities. He'll be followed by Melanie King from EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, who'll be talking about the regulations for stationary RICE. That'll be followed by a question and answer session, which will be moderated by Susan Lancy from EPA Region 1, who also will probably be answering some of the questions. And then we'll have Roy Crystal will be coming back to talk about how combined heat and power facilities can comply with the EPA air quality regulations for stationary RICE. And then we'll follow up with a final question and answer session, again moderated by Susan. We've scheduled 75 minutes for the three presentations and about 40 minutes for the questions. If we do not need for all the time for questions, we'll close the webinar early, so it may not run the entire 2 hours that we have scheduled. On the other hand, if there are questions that are not answered during the webinar, we'll include a log of those questions and their answers on our website, along with the webinar recording. Now I'll go through just some of the logistics for the webinar. You will all be muted throughout the webinar. If you have a question for the presenters or having difficulty with the software or the audio, just put in a question for the staff there in that lower right-hand corner, and someone will respond and help you out. Next slide. We have two polls today. This is sort of an experiment for us. We'll just be asking a couple questions that'll help us all understand sort of who's out there and kind of where they are and what they do. And at the end of the webinar, a feedback survey will appear on your screen. Please take a moment to complete this survey. It really helps us to get your feedback on the webinar. And after the webinar is done, tomorrow we'll have the webinar presentations, and the question and answer log will be on our website next week. And the webinar is also being recorded, and the recording will be available tomorrow morning at the link you see there on your screen. And now I'll just quickly talk a little bit about EPA's Combined Heat and Power Partnership Program. We're one of a suite of EPA programs that work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by encouraging the market to implement clean energy and energy efficient measures. We're a non-regulatory program. We've been here since 2001. We have 510 partners who are typically CHP industry people or energy end users. Those partners together have developed and installed 1,745 operational projects totaling almost 19,000 megawatts, and they have avoided 51 million metric tons of CO2 compared to conventional generation of electricity and thermal energy. We work to remove barriers to CHP deployment by providing technical information, advancing favorable policies here within EPA and elsewhere, and also raising awareness and understanding of CHP among energy end users and the policy community. Now we're going to have our first poll question. So if you just pick one of these answers.
Okay, and we have about 70% of the vote in. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll in just 1 minute. Okay, it looks like 86%. I'm going to close and share the poll with the audience.
Okay, you can see the answers there. It just gives you some sense of where we all are, mostly in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, but a good representation from the rest of the country as well. So now I'm going to introduce Roy Crystal from EPA's Region 1 in Boston, Massachusetts. Roy works with the Assistance and Pollution Prevention Office of EPA's Region 1 New England, where he specializes in providing businesses and institutions with assistance in air quality management and pollution prevention. He is the contact person for the region's assistance on new EPA regulations affecting reciprocating internal combustion engines. So thank you, Roy.
Roy, are you there? You might be on mute. Can you try unmuting yourself?
All right, hi. We've unmuted ourselves here. Bear with us for any little technical glitches. I'm Roy Crystal. I'm going to talk to you today about how operators of combined heat and power facilities can comply with our relatively recent EPA air quality regulations for stationary engines. Next slide, please. So hopefully you are seeing my PowerPoint. We had a little glitch. Our screen froze here. So Sarah at ERG is going to be presenting those slides. The first thing I want to talk to you about is give you an overview of stationary engines. There are about 1.5 million stationary engines in the United States that are affected by EPA's RICE rules in some fashion. And of those, most of them are diesel or compression ignition engines, 78%, and 22% are spark ignition or gas or gasoline-fired engines. About 900,000 of those are used for emergency power, and they vary all over the place in size from 1 kilowatt to greater than 10 megawatts. The main hazardous air pollutants that are emitted from these are those associated with combustion, such as formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, methanol, and PAHs. But they also emit the conventional pollutants that we regulate under the Clean Air Act, such as nitrous oxides, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, and particulate matter. So why do we care about these engine emissions? It's because they cause health effects. Pollutants from stationary engines are known or suspected of causing cancer or other serious health effects. And these include a variety of things like respiratory and cardiovascular disease. They also cause environmental effects. Nitrous oxides and VOCs react in the presence of sunlight to form ozone, which we see on these hot summer days. And Gary mentioned greenhouse gases and the climate change problems we're facing before. Combustion and engines release greenhouse gases as well, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxides. So I hope you are seeing our slides by this point. Next slide, Sarah. So we have a breakdown here of which kinds of fuels and markets these reciprocating engines are used in CHP facilities. And overwhelmingly, it's natural gas, but biogas from landfills and digester units is also fairly sizable. And what kinds of markets utilize these reciprocating engines? It's a variety of markets. Healthcare sector, hospitals and nursing homes, a large variety of kind of miscellaneous commercial, agriculture, wastewater treatment plants, colleges and universities and schools. So there is a certain slice of the market, of the CHP market, kind of the medium-sized slice, where these RICE engines are the most efficient prime mover. So next slide, please. So how does that create an issue? Why is there something that you need to take your time today to learn about? We know that RICE are common prime movers for combined heat and power units, and we have these relatively recent stationary RICE regulations. These apply to you if you have a RICE as the prime mover for your CHP unit. And these are relatively recent regulations. In the process of project development, facilities and consultants are used to dealing with states and going through permitting processes and talking about the air quality requirements for the facility. But they may not be that familiar with the R regs, which have really been coming into play over the last 7 or 8 years. So it's possible that some of the requirements here may not have been attended to. You may not have known about them, or your consultant might have not have known about them, and it's possible that you may be out of compliance. Some of the engines that are used need emission limits, and need to have controls on them, and do things like performance testing and submit notifications to EPA. If that is your situation, it's a cause for concern, but we're here today to show you what to do to come into compliance with the regulations, and you may well learn that you are in good shape. Next slide, please. So there are 3 basic regulations that are part of our RICE regulations. The first is what we call the NESHAP, National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants for stationary RICE. And then there are 2 new source performance standards, one for what we call compression ignition, CI or diesel engines, and one for spark ignition or SI engines. Next slide, please. So let me give you an overview of these regulations. The first one, the RICE NESHAP, is probably the most sweeping. It regulates hazardous air pollutant emissions from stationary RICE at both major and area sources of hazardous air pollutants. And those are listed in the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act. There's a couple of hundred of these hazardous air pollutants. And all sizes of engines are covered. And it covers both new and existing RICE. So it's pretty sweeping. However, with the newer engines, it defers to the new source performance standard. And we've worked to bring these 2 sets of regulations together, and you'll be hearing from Melanie King, who's the rule writer for these regulations. I'll explain to you how they fit together. The new source performance standards really cover the new, modified, and reconstructed sources. They don't cover the existing sources, and they cover the criteria pollutants, so nitrogen oxides and so forth, not the toxics. And they begin to come into play, the new source performance standards. They start phasing in for different types of engines beginning in 2005. Over time, as more and more new engines are put into play at CHP units and elsewhere, the new source performance standards will become more pervasive. Right now, there is a big backlog of engines, existing engines that are regulated under the NESHAP. Next slide, please. So what are the possible uses of RICE or reciprocating engines at a facility that has a CHP unit? Well, the first thing, the obvious one, it may be the prime mover for that CHP unit, the thing that produces the energy. And that is in our RICE reg world, it's a non-emergency use because you want that CHP unit to be going pretty much all the time to be cost effective. But as a facility, you may have engines that you use for other things, so we're not going to focus just on CHP today. We're going to give you the broad sweep of our RICE regs. Most of you probably have an emergency generator. You remember from the first slide, that was the most common use. And it's used for generating backup power in an emergency. Our EPA RICE rules for the first time bring out a kind of a national uniform framework for use of emergency generators. And we're going to tell you what those require. A third circumstance is somebody may be paying you to use your generator. In our lingo, that's a financial arrangement for use of the engine. And there are a couple of different flavors of that kind of financial arrangement. It may be used for what the term is peak shaving, which is really a load management, economic or situational load management, or for emergency demand response, which is pretty much close to a blackout situation, as Melanie will explain more, or for situations to foster local grid reliability. There are other possible non-emergency uses of engines at your facilities that you may have to be aware of. For example, you may just simply have a straight generator, not a CHP, that is used for power production. That's regulated by these rules. You may do something that under our regs for emergency generators, we would consider a non-emergency use of your quote-unquote emergency generator. For example, people out there sometimes will run an emergency generator in a storm or prior to the possible loss of grid power to keep it ready. That's really a non-emergency use, however, as Melanie will explain later. And there are other things like fire pumps, for instance. Next slide, please. Now, this is a graphic just showing a combined heat and power unit with an engine as a prime mover. The thing that I just want to point out about this is the arrow going to the upper right with the exhaust gases from the unit. That's the thing that our rights regs are concerned about regulating, those emissions that go into the atmosphere. At the earlier stages, those gases are being tapped off to utilize the waste heat as part of the CHP unit. But this is the rights regs are really a back-end thing. They're concerned about the emissions that you put into the atmosphere. So engine regulations, these rights regulations are complicated. I will not lie to you. Sometimes you can scratch your head trying to figure out this overall framework. And the reason why it's complicated is because there are a lot of different engines. So next slide. We have a slide here showing how our EPA rights regulations classify engines. And they're all stationary engines, stationary rice. And they fall into two very broad groups, the compression ignition, CI or diesel engines, and the spark ignition engines, those that have spark plugs that run gas or gasoline or other gaseous fuels. The compression ignition engines really just break down into a non-emergency and emergency use category. But the spark ignition engines break down more complexly because there are a variety of both fuels, such as landfill digester gas, and engine designs, such as lean burn and rich burn engines, 2- and 4-stroke engines. And because of their different characteristics, there are different standards and requirements for each of those. So with that, that's kind of an introduction. Melanie King is now going to talk to you about the specifics of these regulations. So we'll switch the screen over to Melanie.
And I'm just going to briefly introduce Melanie. Can I have that slide, Sarah? Yes, we have Melanie King joining us now. She's an environmental engineer in the Energy Strategies Group at the US EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. She is currently working on developing and implementing regulations for emissions from stationary internal combustion engines and combustion turbines. Prior to joining EPA, she worked for the North Carolina Division of Air Quality. Thank you, Melanie.
And thank you, Gary, and thank you to all the folks joining the webinar today. So as Roy mentioned, I'm going to go over some of the specifics of our regulations for stationary engines. Let me get the slides going here. As Roy mentioned, we have 3 regulations that apply to stationary engines, so I thought I'd put the applicability of the regulations side by side so you could compare. We have, as Roy mentioned, what we call our NESHAP, National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, and that's in the Code of Federal Regulations in Part 63. And it applies to both what we call existing, older in-use engines and then also new engines. And the NESHAP applies to both compression ignition or diesel engines and then spark ignition engines. Spark ignition would be your gasoline, natural gas, all your gaseous fuels. And then we have 2 New Source Performance Standard Regulations, or NSPS. We have one for compression ignition engines, and it applies to stationary compression ignition engines that were ordered after July 11th, 05 and manufactured after April 1st of 06, or older compression ignition engines that are modified or reconstructed after July 11th, 05. And then we have our NSPS for spark ignition engines, and that applies to stationary spark ignition engines that are ordered after June 12th of 06 and manufactured on or after. And you can see the specific date depends on the category of the engine. It's either 2007, 2008, 2009. And then any older engines that are modified or reconstructed after June 12th of 2006. What do we mean when we say stationary? We're basically talking about things that are not mobile. So our stationary engine regulations apply to things that are not mobile, and mobile means things that are used in motor vehicles, and then mobile non-road equipment. I think most people know what we mean by motor vehicles, but when we talk about mobile non-road engines, that would be anything that's self-propelled, like a tractor, propelled while performing its function, like a lawnmower, for example, or anything that's portable or transportable, meaning it's on a trailer, it's on a skid. So if an engine falls into one of those three categories, then it's considered to be a mobile non-road engine, and it would not be subject to our stationary engine requirements. And the way the regulation is written, it says if an engine is used in or on a piece of equipment that is self-propelled, for example. So if you have an engine that's mounted on equipment that's self-propelled, even if the engine is not actually doing the propelling, the fact that it's on a piece of equipment that is self-propelled means it's generally considered to be a mobile non-road engine. One thing to keep in mind for that third category listed there, the portable or transportable engines. For those engines, if the engine remains in the same location for more than 12 months or for the full annual operating period of a seasonal source, then it will be considered a stationary engine. And it will be considered stationary from the time that it started remaining, so from the beginning of the 12 months. It doesn't become stationary, once it stays there for 12 months. And note that location is defined as any single site at a building, structure, facility, or installation. So if you have a portable engine, something that's on a trailer or something like that, just be aware that if it does remain in the same location for more than 12 months, it will be considered stationary engine for the purposes of these regulations. So I'm going to talk about the three different regulations, and I'm going to start first with the NESHAP. Just to give you a little bit of background, the NESHAP regulates emissions of hazardous air pollutants from engines at both major and area sources of hazardous air pollutants. And a major source is a facility that emits 10 tons or more per year of a single HAP, or 25 tons or more per year of combined HAP. And it wouldn't just be the engines that we would look at to consider if something is a major source. It's all the stationary emission sources at the facility. So if an engine is located at a refinery or a power plant or something like that, you would look at the emissions from all the emission sources there when you're determining whether a facility is a major or area source. An area source is any source that's not a major source. So if you're not a major source, you're going to be an area source. So you're going to fall into one or the other category. And even if all you have at your facility is the stationary engine and you don't have any other HAP emission sources, you're going to be an area source. So if you've got a stationary engine, you're going to, at a minimum, be an area source. My thinking is that most of the engines that are used for CHP are probably going to be located at area sources. So what we're going to focus on today for purposes of the NESHAP is the requirements for engines at area sources, but I did put some slides at the end as an appendix that do cover the requirements for engines at major sources. The rule does cover all sizes of engines. There's no threshold below which an engine would not be subject to the rule. The only stationary engines that would not be subject to the NESHAP would be existing emergency engines located at residential, institutional, or commercial facilities that are area sources, and that's provided the engine is used or obligated to be available less than 15 hours per year in these type of financial arrangements that Roy was talking about, such as being used in an agreement with a utility for emergency demand response or voltage frequency deviations, and not used for local reliability. And I have some folks have been a little bit confused about that language because they're reading it to say that if you have a backup generator at your facility and you don't participate at all in any sort of emergency demand response or anything like that, they're thinking that this language would not apply to them and that the engine is subject to the rule. But no, if your engine is not used at all for emergency demand response or local reliability or voltage or frequency deviation, that counts as being used or obligated less than 15 hours per year for those purposes. So if you have an existing emergency engine at a residential, institutional, or commercial facility and it's not used at all for emergency demand response, then you would be considered not subject to the rule. And if you have a facility and you're wondering whether it would meet the definition, there are definitions in the rule for residential, institutional, or commercial. And we also have a memo on our website that lists all the NAICS codes and whether that type of application would be considered residential, institutional, or commercial. So that's a good resource if you're not sure about whether your facility would be classified. So the rule differentiates, the requirements in the rule are different for engines depending on things such as the category of the engine, like Roy was talking about, lean burn, rich burn, and then the size of the engine, and then also whether the engine is considered to be an existing engine or a new engine. And the way we define that for engines that are greater than 500 horsepower at major sources, it's existing if construction commenced before December 19th of 2002. If the engine is less than or equal to 500 horsepower at a major source of HAP, or if it's any size and an area source of HAP, it's existing if construction commenced before June 12th of 2006. And the way we define construction, it actually defaults to a definition that's in subpart A of part 63. And I've paraphrased it here, but it's essentially when the owner-operator of the engine has entered into a contractual obligation for the on-site installation of the engine. So that would be the construction date of the engine. And note that the definition says that construction does not include the removal from one existing location, and I'm paraphrasing here, but moving it to a new location. So just if you have an engine that's at a facility and it's been operating at that facility, and you pick it up and you move it to another facility, and there may or may not be a change in ownership, that doesn't change the construction date of the facility, of the engine, excuse me. You need to look at the date that construction commenced when it was a brand new engine. So that's a little bit of background. Now I'm going to go into the specific requirements, and I'm going to start with the non-emergency engines at area sources of hazardous air pollutants. So this table here shows the different emission standards, and you can see, as I mentioned, we break it down into the different categories: compression ignition, and then the different types of spark ignition engines. This is two-stroke lean burn, and then this is four-stroke in remote areas, four-stroke not in remote areas, and then landfill gas or digester gas-fired engines. So you can see here the smaller engines, and then all of the two-stroke and landfill and digester gas engines have what we call management practices. They're essentially maintenance requirements, so it's change the oil, inspect air cleaner, hoses and belts on a prescribed schedule. The engines that I've highlighted here in yellow, these are the engines that we expect you would need to retrofit your engine with a control device in order to meet the emission standards. The rule doesn't mandate the use of a specific control device. It just provides an emission limit for these engines that they have to meet. So it's up to the owner-operator to determine how they want to meet the emission limit. But there is a CO standard for compression ignition engines above 300 horsepower. It's either a parts per million or a % reduction standard. And then also for spark ignition four-stroke engines above 500 horsepower that are not in remote areas, if the engine is used more than 24 hours per year, we have what we call an equipment standard. So for four-stroke lean burn engines, they have to install an oxidation catalyst. And then for four-stroke rich burn engines, they have to install a non-selective catalytic reduction. That's essentially like the catalytic converter on your car. So those are the requirements for existing engines. And then I've noted here for new non-emergency engines located at area sources, all that you have to do for the NESHAP is to meet our new source performance standard. So it just points you to the Code of Federal Regulations for the new source performance standards, and it just says meet those requirements and nothing further applies under the NESHAP. I wanted on the next slide to explain this, how we define the remote area here. So again, there's this distinction between remote and non-remote. So how do we define remote? There's 3 different categories specified in the rule. So an engine would be considered remote if it's either located in an offshore area or it's located on a pipeline segment with 10 or fewer buildings intended for human occupancy and no buildings with 4 or more stories within 220 yards on a 1 mile set length of a pipeline segment. This is essentially the second criteria here is aimed at engines used in oil and gas applications. And then the third criteria is if you have an engine that's not located on a pipeline, if there are 5 or fewer buildings intended for human occupancy and no buildings within 4 or more stories within a quarter-mile radius around the engine. So if you meet that definition of a remote engine, and if you met it as of October 19th of 2013, which was the compliant state, then you would fall into this category here of spark ignition engines in remote areas. And this category here, 4-stroke spark ignition engines above 500 horsepower existing at an area source, that's where this remote distinction comes into play. So those were the emission standards. Here are the compliance requirements. If you have one of these existing non-emergency compression ignition engines above 300 horsepower that is subject to a CO limit for formaldehyde, for percent reduction or ppm, you will have to do a performance test. You have to do an initial test, and then if your engine is above 500 horsepower, you have to do a subsequent test every 87, 60 hours of operation or 3 years. Or if you only use your engine less than 100 hours per year, the interval can be 5 years. In addition to the testing, you will have operating limitations on your engine. So the rule specifies that the catalyst pressure drop and the catalyst inlet temperature has to stay within a certain range. And you have to do a monthly check of the catalyst pressure drop, and you have to continuously monitor your catalyst inlet temperature. That's if your engine is above 500 horsepower. You also have to submit some notifications to EPA or, in some cases, your state or local air pollution control agency. You have to submit semi-annual compliance reports. Again, if you have a limited use engine, you can do those annually. The engine has to use ultra-low sulfur diesel, and then there are also some crankcase emission control requirements. If you have one of these existing spark ignition 4-stroke engines above 500 horsepower at an area source that's not in a remote area, these are the engines that have to do the equipment standard to install catalyst. So you would have to do an initial and an annual catalyst activity check. You have to equip the engine with a high temperature engine shutdown or continuously monitor your catalyst inlet temperature. And you will also have to do notifications and compliance reports. If you have one of the engines that was only subject to the what we call the management practices, essentially the maintenance requirements, change the oil, inspect hoses, belts, etc. I've listed these engines here. But what you need to do for those engines is just operate and maintain the engine per the manufacturer's instructions or your own maintenance plan. You can use an oil analysis program instead of changing the oil on the prescribed frequency. You have to keep records of maintenance. You do not have to submit notifications to EPA. And this is a little more information about the oil analysis program. The rule specifies certain parameters, and then what you would do is at whatever the interval the rule specifies for your oil change, if it's 1,000 hours, say, you would do that analysis at that 1,000 hour, at or before the 1,000 hours, and look at these parameters. And if the condemning limits had not been reached, then you would not need to change the oil, and then you would go to the next interval, so the next 1,000 hours or whatever the interval is, and do the analysis again, and so on. Once you do reach the condemning limits for the oil, the rule specifies that you have to change the oil within 2 business days, and you do need to keep records of the analysis. So those are the requirements for non-emergency engines. I'm going to go now into the requirements for emergency engines at area sources of hazardous air pollutants. Probably the first question is what do we define as an emergency engine? And we basically have excerpted some of the definition here, but it's operated to provide power or work during an emergency situation. And we give some examples in the rule, like providing power when power from the normal source is interrupted, or pumping water in the case of fire or flood. Those are by no means the only types of situations, you know, that an engine cannot be operated and be considered an emergency engine. So those are just some examples. And then we say that the engine must limit its operation in non-emergency situations as specified in the rule to be considered an emergency engine. And here's some more information about that. So these are the limits that are in the rule. There's no limit on the operation in an emergency situation. So if you know, an ice storm comes and takes out the power lines, or a hurricane, or you know, an earthquake or something like that, there's no limit on operating the engine in that type of situation. Then there's a limit of 100 hours per calendar year that can be used for maintenance and readiness testing of the engine. You can use the engine for emergency demand response if an energy emergency alert level 2 has been declared by the reliability coordinator. That was the operating in a financial arrangement type of situation that Roy mentioned. You don't have to use your engine for emergency demand response in order to be considered an emergency engine. We're just saying that if you do use it in a financial arrangement, you have to keep it under these limitations in order to be considered an emergency engine. So there's emergency demand response, and then there's the voltage or frequency deviations of 5% or greater below the standard. Then we go on to say that you can use it for 50 hours, up to 50 of that 100 hours per calendar year can be used for a couple of different things, one of which is non-emergency situations if there's no financial arrangement. And an example of that would be some folks, we've been told, want to turn on their engines if there's a storm in the area because they don't want to, you know, it's sort of a just in case the power goes out type of thing, because they don't want to have any sort of blip in the power or something like that. So our view of that has been, you know, that doesn't really seem like it would be an emergency situation, but that would be allowed for up to the 50 hours per year for non-emergency situations. So there's that category, and then there's this another type of financial arrangement. We call it this local reliability as part of a financial arrangement. So this would be more like you have a program with your, like if, for example, if you're in a rural area and you have a rural cooperative that provides your electricity, they have some programs where they enroll engines and they operate them in financial arrangements. So you can, that's okay as long as your engine is an existing, as long as it meets the criteria here. I've listed them all. You know, existing engine at an area source, dispatched by the local system operator. Dispatch is intended to mitigate local limitations to avert voltage collapse or line overload. So all that criteria that are listed there, you would have to meet to operate your engine and still be considered an emergency engine. And then we did have this third category, which was a temporary allowance for peak shaving in local systems, but that's over now. That went away on May 3rd of 2014. So be aware that if you are using your engine for peak shaving, it would not be considered an emergency engine under our regulations, and you need to meet the requirements for non-emergency engines. We do have some compliance requirements for these engines. We have maintenance requirements similar to what we talked about for some of the non-emergency engines, so it's change the oil, inspect hoses and belts every 500 hours or annually, inspect air cleaner or spark plugs every 1,000 hours or annually, whichever comes first. Again, you can use an oil analysis program. You have to operate and maintain it per the manufacturer's instructions, minimize your time spent at startup and idle. You do need to have a non-resettable hour meter and keep records of your hours of operation and your maintenance. Again, notifications are not required for these engines. If you have a new engine, similar to what we talked about for non-emergency engines, you need to meet the NSPS, and that's your only requirement under the NESHAP. We do have fuel requirements for certain emergency engines. If you have an emergency compression ignition engine above 500 horsepower, less than 30 liters per cylinder displacement, and you are operating that engine in a financial arrangement for emergency demand response or voltage frequency deviations or local reliability, then beginning January 1st of 2015, you are required to use ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel in the engine. And we did specify that any existing inventory that you have on hand beginning January 1st of 2015 can be depleted. In addition to fuel requirements, if you for those same emergency engines that are being used in these financial arrangements for emergency demand response or voltage frequency deviations or local reliability. If that engine is above 100 horsepower, we have a reporting requirement that begins with operation in the year 2015. You're going to have to report to us some information like the facility name and address, the dates and start and end times that you operated for these emergency demand response, voltage frequency deviation, or local reliability type of situations, and several other things. So the first report will have to be submitted by March 31st of 2016, and then March 31st of 2017, and so on. And we are setting up a way that you would be required to submit it electronically through our electronic reporting interface. We're still working on getting that set up, but I think the plan is to have that all set up by the end of this year so that we'll be ready to go when 2015 and 2016 rolls around. So those are the reporting requirements. Some key dates, if you do have an engine where an initial notification was required, it's not required for all of the engines, but it is for some. It's generally those that have to submit or that are subject to a CO limit. We're well past the date for submitting those initial notifications. That was in 2010 or 2011. The compliance dates for the existing engines located at area sources of hazardous air pollutants, the compliance date for the compression ignition was May 3rd of 2013. For spark ignition, it was October 19th of 2013. So if you're just now realizing that you have an engine that may be subject to these requirements, just be aware that the compliance date has passed, so you need to come into compliance as soon as possible. If you have a new engine, then you do have to comply upon startup. So that's an overview of the NESHAP. I'm going to move now into the NSPS for compression ignition engines. And again, I covered this initially, but the applicability of this rule, it applies to owners and operators of stationary compression ignition engines that were ordered after July 11th, 2005 and manufactured after April 1 of 2006 or July 1 of 2006 if it's a fire pump engine. And one thing I wanted to draw your attention to is that in the NSPS we define construction differently than we did in the NESHAP. If you remember in the NESHAP, it was when the owner or operator entered into a contractual obligation for the on-site installation. In the NSPS, we define construction as the date the engine was ordered. So it applies to those newly manufactured engines, and then it also applies to older engines that are modified or reconstructed after July 11, 2005. And modification, kind of in simple terms, there's a little bit more to it than this, but it's when you've increased the emissions of a regulated pollutant. And reconstruction is if you replace enough components of the engine such that the cost of the new components exceeds 50% of the cost of a comparable entirely new engine. There's more, regulatory text associated with modification and reconstruction. So if you want to review that, it is in subpart A of part 60. There's, a lot more qualifications and things like that, but it's in subpart A of part 60. So the rule applies to both the owners and operators, and then it also applies to engine manufacturers. So manufacturers of 2007 model year and later stationary compression ignition engines. And I put the definition, an excerpt from the regulatory definition of manufacturer there. Any person who manufactures an engine for sale or otherwise introduces it into commerce. And it does include importers who import stationary engines for sale or resale. So the requirements for engine manufacturers, they have to certify 2007 model year and later stationary compression ignition engines, provided they have a displacement of less than 30 liters per cylinder. And by certify, I mean they get an EPA certificate of conformity for their engine. So there's a whole process that they go through where they test the engine and they submit that data to EPA, and then EPA submits a certificate of conformity. And I put an example of what the certificate looks like there. And also, they should be labeling the engine. So this is an example label here. It has a statement on here that it conforms to 2007 model year EPA. And they have non-road on here. They should also be putting stationary, but I know sometimes they don't. So it should have, the engine family and that kind of thing, and some fuel information and things like that. So if you're buying new engines, they should be labeled, and they should have a certificate of conformity. We don't post the certificates on our website, but we do post some spreadsheets that list all the engine families that were certified by the model year, so that information is available. So that's the requirements for manufacturers. For owners and operators, if you have a 2007 model year and later engine, you need to be purchasing an engine that's certified, and again, certified meaning Certificate of Conformity from EPA. And it needs to be certified to the emission standards that apply to that engine based on its model year, its size, and its application, meaning emergency or non-emergency. And the emission standards that apply are generally equivalent to what we call our tier standards for non-road engines. And the particular tier that applies to an engine depends, again, on the model year and the size and the application. And I've actually got an example here, an example of a 300 kW non-emergency engine. So if you are buying one in the 2007 to 2010 model year, it has to meet what we call the Tier 3 standards. And those are for CO, the hydrocarbons, your NOx, and your particulate matter. If you're buying one in the 2011 to 2013 model year, they have to meet at least our Tier 4 interim standards. So again, the CO and the hydrocarbon and NOx didn't change, but the PM standard is tighter for that engine. And then if you're model year 2014 and later, the engine needs to meet our what we call our Tier 4 final standards. Again, CO doesn't change, but you can see the PM and the hydrocarbon and your NOx are lower. So you might, if you hear the tier terminology, that's just what we call the standards. We call them the tier standards. So you need to buy a certified engine. You need to install, configure, operate, and maintain it per your manufacturer's instructions. If you do that, you don't have to do any performance testing to show that the engine complies with the standards. If you do elect to operate the engine differently than the manufacturer's recommendations, you do need to do a performance test to show that the engine complies with the standards. And one example of something that you could do would be, I've heard folks are taking compression ignition engines and putting what they call them bi-fuel kits or dual fuel kits on them that would allow the engine to operate on diesel fuel as well as natural gas. So if you do that to your engine, it's no longer in the configuration that was certified by the manufacturer. So you're going to fall into this, operating differently than the manufacturer's recommendations, and you have to do a performance test to show compliance. And then the last requirement that I listed here is that these engines do have to use ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel. We do have requirements in the rule for engines built from, I just went over the 2007 model year and later because, that would be the most common. We do have requirements for engines built from April 1 of 06 to the end of 06. And then also engines with a displacement greater than 30 liters per cylinder, and those are really huge engines. And then also modified or reconstructed engines. I didn't go over those, but just be aware that there are requirements. So if you have an engine, one of those engines, you can check the rule for the requirements. There are monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements. If you have an emergency engine, you have to have a non-resettable hour meter and keep records of the hours of operation if the engine is certified as emergency use only. If you have an engine that has a diesel particulate filter, what we call a DPF, you have to have a back pressure monitor and keep records of any corrective actions. And then if you have a non-emergency engine above 300 horsepower or with a displacement of greater than 10 liters per cylinder, you do have to submit an initial notification, keep records of that and the engine maintenance. If it's certified, keep those records, and if it's not certified, which that would be potentially your 2006 model year engines because they weren't required to be certified, you would have to keep records of whatever compliance demonstration you use for that engine. So that's the requirement for compression ignition. I'm going to go over the spark ignition engines, and again, that would be your natural gas, gasoline, LPG, propane, landfill and digester gas engines. So this rule applies to owners and operators of spark ignition engines constructed, and again, that means that's defined as ordered after June 12th of 06 and manufactured after the date specified in the rule for the particular category of engine. So if it's a lean burn engine, 500 to 1350 horsepower, if it was manufactured after January 1 of 08 and constructed after June 12th of 06, it's subject to the rule. And then for older engines, if they're modified or reconstructed after June 12th of 2006, they also become subject to the rule. It's a little bit, this rule is a little bit different than the compression ignition engine in SPS because with the compression ignition rule, almost all engines are required to be certified by the manufacturer. Here, engine manufacturers are only required to certify spark ignition engines if they're less than or equal to 25 horsepower, or if they're greater than 25 horsepower and they're gasoline or rich burn LPG engines, they have to be certified. But that leaves a whole, a whole group of engines, like natural gas engines above 25 horsepower, for example, that manufacturers are not required to certify. I think they are certifying some, but certainly not all of the engines. So just be aware for spark ignition engines, if you're going out and buying one that's above 25 horsepower, that's not gasoline or rich burn LPG, there's a good chance it may not be certified by the engine manufacturer. Just in general, I actually find this regulation to be the most complicated. I know a lot of folks think the NESHAP is, but I find this one to be. So the emission standards, again, depend on the type of engine you have. If it's less than 25 horsepower, it's going to say, the rule's going to say meet the standards that are in Part 90 or Part 1054 that we adopted for non-road engines. So we just point to standards for a comparable non-road engine and say meet those standards. If they're non-emergency gasoline or rich burn LPG engines or natural gas and lean burn engines 25 to 100 horsepower, our regulations point to the standards in Part 1048 and say meet those standards in Part 1048. If it's above 100 horsepower and it's not gasoline or rich burn LPG engine, then the regulation says meet the standards in Table 1 of Subpart JJJJ. And they're basically NOx, CO, and VOC standards. And you have the option of meeting either a grams per horsepower hour or a ppm standard. And there is a different standard depending on the model year. So I think we did do something kind of similar to the tiers, but I think we only basically have 2 tiers. For example, some of them are like model year 2008 through 2010 have one tier, and then 2011 and later have another tier. So that's kind of what's in Table 1. If you have a gasoline engine, you do have to use gasoline that meets the sulfur cap of 80 parts per million. In terms of the compliance requirements, if you do have an engine that's certified by the manufacturer, so say it's an engine less than 25 horsepower, for example, similar to what we require for diesel engines or compression ignition engines, you have to install, configure, operate, and maintain it according to the manufacturer's instructions. If you do elect to not operate and maintain it according to the manufacturer's instructions, you have to have a maintenance plan and operate consistent with good air pollution control practices. If it's 100 to 500 horsepower, you have to do an initial performance test to show that the engine still meets the emission standards. And then also if the engine is rebuilt or undergoes major repair or maintenance, you would have to retest, so in addition to the initial test. If it's above 500 horsepower, you have to do an initial test, and then you also have to do subsequent testing every 87, 60 hours or 3 years, whichever comes first. So that's the requirements for engines that are originally certified by the manufacturer. If you have an engine that was not originally certified by the manufacturer, you have to have a maintenance plan and you have to do performance testing. 25 to 500 horsepower, you have to do an initial test and again retest if it's rebuilt or has major maintenance. If it's above 500 horsepower, you have to do an initial test and then subsequent every 87, 60 hours or 3 years, whichever comes first. And that test does have to be done at high load conditions. In terms of the monitoring, record keeping, and reporting, a non-resettable hour meter, again, for emergency engines, documentation if it's certified, any records of any maintenance. If it's an engine that's not certified and above 500 horsepower, you do have to submit an initial notification. And if it's an engine for which you do have to do performance testing, you do have to submit those results to us within 60 days of the test. This is my contact information. Feel free to contact me if you have general questions about the regulations. We do also have 10 regional offices. I think Roy's going to cover this a little bit, but we do have regional offices across the country. So if you have a site-specific question, I would encourage you to talk to your regional office, or if your state or local air pollution control agency has taken delegation of the rules, you can also talk to them. So I'm going to turn it back now to our moderators. Okay.
And Gary, are you there?
Oh, sorry. Hi. This is Gary McNeil. I'm introducing Susan Lancy, who's at EPA's Region 1 in Boston, Massachusetts. Susan is going to be moderating the question and answer sessions for us. So go ahead, Susan.
Okay, thank you, Gary. So we do have quite a few questions, and I think what we were going to do before we take the questions is actually run a poll. So we'll take a quick poll, and then we'll get on to the questions that we have. Could you please identify yourself? Please select one of the following: project developer, engineer, or consultant, a facility owner or manager, an engine manufacturer, or a CHP equipment manufacturer, or other. And we'll give you a few seconds to answer this and then look at the results.
Okay, and with 78% of the vote in, we'll go ahead and share the results.
Okay, so we can see that a good percentage are from project developer, engineer, or consultant. We have some facility owners, as well as engine manufacturers and CHP equipment manufacturers, and then also a large category of other. We're going to take a few questions now, and then we have a lot of time at the end for questions. So let's get started. Melanie, I was wondering if Melanie could go back to her slide 8, but if that's not really easy. We did have a couple of questions about slide 8, which was the slide that describes the difference between requirements for existing non-emergency rights at area sources, and there's a category of less than or equal to 300, and then the next category was 300 to 500 horsepower. So I'm just wondering, Melanie, which one of those? There's an overlap between the 300 horsepower in those two categories.
Oh, okay. So you're talking about if you had something that's exactly 300 horsepower. Or
yeah, which category did it fall into?
I think it should be less than or equal to 300, and then greater than 300 to 500. So if you're exactly at 300 horsepower, you would fall into the less than or equal to 300.
Okay. All right. Thanks. This is also, Melanie, I think most of these questions are for you. What is the latest version of the Spark Ignition ICE New Source Performance Standards?
The latest version, the rule has not been, the rule was amended last in January, or I guess the amendment was published in January of 2013, and then would have taken effect in March of 2013. So that would be the last time it was amended. I find the best place to get the most recent version of the rule is our electronic Code of Federal Regulations, which I believe is just www.ecfr.gov. So that usually has the most up-to-date version of the rule, and once amendments take effect, they usually have that updated within a day or two. So that's what I normally use.
Okay.
I guess that is an unofficial version though, and the official version, I guess, only gets updated once a year.
Okay, thank you. That helps answer a later question where somebody has asked, where there's a good reference to a complete up-to-date regulation. the ECFR is what we use, and that's posted on our websites as well. Does the RICE NESHAP apply to sources that are major for criteria pollutants, but not major for HAPs?
Yeah, I mean, if they have stationary engines, yes. Now, their major or area source status for the NESHAP is based on their emissions of HAP. So just because you're major for criteria pollutants doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be major for the purposes of, HAP for the NESHAP. That's my understanding anyway.
Right. So the regulation does apply, but it sets the standards based on whether they're major or area for hazardous air pollutants.
Right.
So that's what they would need to look at rather than their major source status for criteria pollutants. Does the compliance report that's due on March of 2016 apply only to major sources? And I'm assuming that's the electronic reporting, the new electronic reporting requirement for...
Right. It does not apply only to major sources. It applies to any emergency stationary engines above 100 horsepower that are, but it only applies if they're enrolled in these financial arrangements for emergency demand response or voltage frequency deviations or local reliability. So if an engine is not being used in one of those programs, the reporting is not required.
Okay. Thank you. Is it illegal to import a non-conforming engine?
I have to say I'm not an expert on the importation. That's not one I can answer without reviewing the regulations.
Thank you. What happens when an engine warranty expires? Does it become a non-certified engine? Do you know the answer to that one, Melanie?
I don't think, not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, but that would probably be something we'd want to look.
Yeah, I think we would want to know more. What exactly do you mean by the warranty expires?
Okay. There's a question about the difference between the definition of construction under the NESHAP regulation versus the new source performance rule. So the NESHAP looks at when you entered into a contractual obligation, and the NSPS is when it was ordered.
Right, but for the NESHAP, it's contractual obligation for the on-site installation of the engine. Sometimes, I guess, folks can order engines without, knowing where they're going to be installed, like knowing what actually location they can be installed.
Okay. So there could be a difference between those dates, but then again, they actually could be the same thing, I guess.
Exactly. Yes, they could. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. What or where are the definitions for the emergency stationary engine exemptions?
By exemptions, meaning the residential, institutional, commercial, or for something else?
Yeah, it doesn't. It's very general. Okay. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a definition in the rule for the language. The language is in one of the first sections of the rule. That the language that says if you're at a residential, institutional, or commercial, you're not subject to the rule. The definitions for emergency engine and then for residential, institutional, commercial are in the. There's a section in the rule that's something like what definitions apply, and then the language about the limits on operation of an emergency engine, like the 100 hours per year for maintenance and testing, et cetera. That's within the rule, like in the NESHAP, it's in 63.6640F. So that is within the regulatory text.
Okay, thank you. And we did want to mention that for some of these questions where we think we need to follow up to be certain of the answer, we're going to try to provide a question and answer log on the website. So, do you know, Melanie, are there non-emergency compression ignition engines from 2006 or 2007 which must be certified to the new source performance standards and a catalyst requirement for HAP controls?
I mean, yeah, there could be, like, for example, yeah, a 2007 model year engine has to be certified by the manufacturer, and then if it's, for example, above 500 horsepower and located at a major source of hazardous air pollutants, it also has additional requirements under the NESHAP, which we didn't go over the major source standards, but you know, it could be subject to both requirements for certification and then also requirements under the NESHAP.
Okay, thanks. So I think at this point, I need some more time to screen through some of these questions. We should turn it back over to Roy Crystal from EPA Region 1, and he is going to continue to go through his presentation. And then we have time at the end for more questions.
Thank you, Susan. We should go back now to my slide 11, which says suggested procedure for complying with EPA RICE requirements, and I see it's on the screen. So, have you got that now? It's complicated, right? What I would say is you're not going to memorize the RICE regulations. It may be that the requirements that apply to you specifically are quite simple, but you need a little guide. You need a trail of breadcrumbs with RICE. Samuel Johnson, back in the 17th century, who wrote the first English dictionary, and right when this very rich language of ours was being pulled together for the first time, said, knowledge is of two kinds. We may know a thing, or we may know how to find out about a thing. And so for these RICE regs, what I'm going to suggest to you is a procedure for how to find out what your requirements are. So you don't have to think you're going to have to memorize this. This is a step-by-step procedure. It's not a regulatory requirement anyway. It's just a set of suggestions for how to determine what you have to do. As you heard, there are many different classes of RICE. As Melanie explained, they have very different compliance requirements. So your task is really to develop an inventory to classify all your RICE in an Excel spreadsheet or something of the kind for these key factors to determine the compliance requirements, horsepower and so on, existing versus new. And then once you have that framework, you can use some of the web tools that we'll tell you about along with the inventory to determine what your compliance requirements are. After that, what you have to do is take timely actions to meet the requirements. And you may get stuck at some point in this process. If you do, pick up the phone, call EPA or a state that's delegated to enforce the rule, and there are people out there that can help you determine this. So let's go to the next slide. And these are the steps of the step-by-step procedure. First thing, are your RICE stationary or mobile? Next thing, classify the RICE by these key factors, determine if they're emergency or non-emergency, and then see whether or not they fall maybe into this residential, commercial, or institutional category, such that your emergency RICE might not even be subject to the RICE NESHAP at all. For CHP facilities, this is probably, if you've got a non-emergency RICE, probably not an issue. Next, is it a major area source or new or existing? Once you have that framework, you can determine your compliance requirements and then review the compliance dates and address any non-compliance. So next slide, please. There are several key compliance requirements for facilities with CHP units, and I want to flag those for you. The first situation that may be difficult and that you may need to attend to, if you have one of the existing non-emergency RICE that has emission limits, for example, it's a CHP prime mover and it's in that category that Melanie showed in the table, that it has emission limits and a requirement to put in controls. That's a very important thing to attend to. The second thing, and that would be really more for an existing unit. The second thing is these performance testing requirements for the new spark ignition engines. I hope you could see from Melanie's presentation that the new force performance standards for diesel engines are kind of different from the ones for our spark ignition engines. In the spark ignition engine world, we made it optional whether the manufacturers wanted to certify certain kinds of engines, where in the compression ignition ones, pretty much all of them had to be certified, and you complied by purchasing a certified engine. For the spark ignition one, there's a lot of engines that you might purchase that would not be certified. In that case, those over 25 horsepower would need to have a performance test, which could be a surprise. And that includes prime movers for combined heat and power units. Now, getting away from the CHP world and just talking to those of you that have other kinds of engines, for emergency engines, you have to stay within these emergency thresholds according to the race NESHAP and the other regs that Melanie was talking about. So that's the threshold of 100 hours for the total of maintenance testing and emergency demand response. And lastly, another important issue is when you have a financial arrangement to operate your engine, such as peak shaving, complying with the limits that apply in that case. Next slide, please. So classifying your rights in terms of the key factors, we've been over these. Horsepower is a key factor, as well as the date constructed or reconstructed. You're going to need to have the hours of use, which means that you have to start, if you haven't already, tracking your engine hours of use, or look it up. The annual hours of use in emergency and non-emergency situations, and for maintenance and testing. You may not have been looking at this data. You've got to go out and get it. And you're going to have to look at what are your contract obligations and the hours of use that are in any arrangements, financial arrangements you have for being paid for using your engine. Next slide, please. So Melanie mentioned how you determine if your source is major or area. A major source has a facility-wide potential to emit greater than or equal to 10 tons per year of any single hazardous air pollutant, or greater than or equal to 25 tons per year of combined hazardous air pollutants. And for different sectors, we have guidance published at different locations on our website for how to calculate potential to emit, which is basically 24/7 use the year round. If you are not within those major source categories, you're an area source, and that's what most of you will probably be. Next slide, please. So just reiterating again, the kind of 3 or 4 circumstances that are key to be concerned about, especially if you have a CHP unit. Under the NESHAP, an existing non-emergency spark ignition 4-stroke rice at an area source that's greater than 500 horsepower, so it's pretty big, and it's not in a remote area, has to install controls if it's used for more than 24 hours a year. And that's the equipment standard that Melanie spoke of. If it's a lean burn engine, it needs an oxidation catalyst, which is basically a catalytic converter. If it's a rich burn engine, it needs non-selective catalytic reduction, or NSCR. So bottom line takeaway, you might have to have controls on your engine in that circumstance with the CHP unit. The second thing is the testing requirement for, under the NSCS, those spark ignition engines greater than 25 horsepower that aren't certified by the manufacturer require performance tests. Again, underlining that issue, stay within the limits that are defined under our regs for what is emergency use of your engine, and that's 100 hours total for the total of maintenance testing and emergency demand response. If you just have an emergency engine and you do not have any financial arrangements for use of your engine, it's going to be pretty straightforward. Next slide, please. When somebody is paying you to use your engine, things get a little more complicated. You have to figure out which of these different flavors of financial arrangement you have. It could be emergency demand response, which is basically a situation pretty close to a blackout. It could be peak shaving or load management, which is really more economic use of the engine, or a local reliability program. The way to find out is to read your contract. The requirements will differ for each of these types of financial arrangements. Melanie mentioned that the allowance for 50 hours of peak shaving or non-emergency demand response for emergency engines at area sources has ended as of May 3rd of 2014. So if you're in that situation, you're doing peak shaving, you have a choice to make. If you want to continue with the peak shaving program with the utility, you're going to have to comply with the non-emergency requirements. Now, we've been talking about the EPA air quality regs for engines here today, but states have been regulating engines for a long time, and you have to comply with both of those kinds of standards. And a way to find that out is to check the state regulatory agency air quality webpage. Next slide, please. So we have developed a number of information sources on EPA compliance requirements. I was hoping to show you some of these after I get through the full presentation. We'll go to some of them. We've had a little problem with our computer here freezing. So I'm going to pretty much talk you through what is on the sites. And if we have time, we will show you one tool in particular, the regulation navigation tools. The first one is epa.gov/region1/RICE. And this is one we developed here in EPA Region 1. It's a user-friendly kind of guide to the RICE regs. Down the left-hand column, it shows a general description of the regulations. And then we have boxes on the right-hand side with a variety of tools. This PowerPoint from today will be posted on there. We have other PowerPoints from previous presentations. For instance, there's one on there that gives more information on performance or stack testing. And we have lots of links. We have you can download from there the initial notifications and notifications of compliance status forms. And we also can have a link on there to the national RICE webpage. That one was updated earlier this year, around about September, to be more user-friendly. It's got 4 tabs at the top on the National RICE HI's homepage. One of them has all the Federal Register notices, so and this rule has been amended and changed a lot. So you can go back through any of that regulatory history. And then there's a section called Implementation Information, a tab at the top, where most of these tools are. So you can go to a variety of things there and see those. Here's a link for the electronic code of federal regulations. The ECFR, which came out in the question periods, is probably the best place to go for the up-to-date regulation. So let's go to the next slide. So after you have figured out your requirements, look at the compliance dates and figure out whether you have any non-compliance. Again, the biggest concern is probably going to be those engines with emission limits that needed to install controls and have notification requirements. As Melanie mentioned, those notifications were due some time ago, back in February 16th of 2011 for the spark ignition engines. But the answer in general is if you're out of compliance, get in touch with EPA and turn in what you have to turn in as soon as possible. By the compliance dates, which have also passed, non-emergency engines under the RICE NESHAP had to have their controls installed and meet all of their other compliance requirements. So that was, for example, for the spark ignition engines, it was October 19th of 2013, and you got 180 days after that to complete your performance test. So these are in the rear view mirror now. So if you find that you had to do something, talk within your company, secure the funding you need, and immediately move to take any needed compliance actions. And in that process, communicate with the regulated agency. It's EPA in much of the country, but there are also states that are delegated for these rules, and some local regs, air quality control districts and so forth. So communicate with the agency, explain the situation. That's the best thing to do. Next slide, please. So should you need more help or information, I'm glad we had a good representation in New England today. Susan Lancy and myself can be contacted in New England. My number is 617-918-1745. I'm glad to answer your questions. I'm kind of coordinating our assistance on the RICE regs. Susan has some other responsibilities. She's our air toxics coordinator, and she's also the contact for applicability determination specifically. Are you subject to this rule? She would be the one to call about that in EPA Region 1. We are willing to answer a question that is general elsewhere, but we get a lot of calls from around the country because of these things we're doing. So we would appreciate you contacting your regional RICE contact, and that is on the National RICE webpage. Up towards the top, there is a box that says Regional Contacts. Under the implementation information is the Regional Contacts box. All 10 EPA regions have somebody that's responsible for RICE. And you really must talk to them if you have anything that's site-specific at all. So that is where you go for more help. If we're going okay on the time, what we're going to try to do now, and hopefully this will work with our little bit of our computer difficulties that we have. Sarah Greenberg from ERG is going to help me here to show you the regulation navigation tool. So Sarah, are you able to bring that up?
Yes, you should see it momentarily. Can't see it already. It's just loading.
So we refer to this as sort of a TurboTax tool, again along the lines of figure out how to get your answer done. And if you develop that inventory I was talking about, it should be a snap to use this tool. And we have two of them actually, one for the NESHAP and one for both of the two NSPS standards combined. So this is the first thing. Why don't you go ahead to the next screen, Sarah? And it works you through an introduction, what it does. Next, advance it. And it gives you some of the key definitions that are used. And then it gets to the first question. Do you have, it's a little hard to read on the screen here, do you own or operate a stationary engine? We're going to say yes to fill in that box. Here's a special circumstance. Is your engine being tested at a stationary RICE cell or stand? Most of the time that's going to be no. And here's a question about potential to emit and getting at whether you are a major area source. Do you have the potential to emit more than 10 tons of any single HAP or 25 tons combined? We're going to say no. And that shows you're an area source. So we'll go to the next prompt. Did you begin construction or reconstruction on your stationary engine before June 12, 2006? We're going to say we're an existing engine, so we're going to say yes. An older engine. Is it greater than 500 horsepower? We're going to say yes. So here it gives you several different categories of engines, and we're going to select the non-emergency spark ignition 4-stroke rich burn. So that's like the fourth one from the bottom. And what is the classification? Is this a remote or non-remote engine? We're going to say we're not a remote engine. So now it brings you to a set of the actual standards. So we're going to click on that and open that up. Now what this shows you here, it's not quite as user-friendly as it might be. It gives you the links for different categories of types of regulations, operating limitations, testing requirements, and so forth. It gives you rule language and links to the portions of the rule. But it gets you to the key requirements that apply to you. And I think the structure of this thing, it's worthwhile to go through it because you see the thinking underpinning the rule. There's different branchings within here. But if you can just find your way through this trail of breadcrumbs, you can find the regs that apply to you, and then you can go back in the ECFR or look in one of the posted PowerPoints and see the regulations that apply to you. So the one for the New Source Performance Standard has a very similar kind of structure. So with that, I think we'll switch things over to Susan for the second set of questions and answers.
Okay, so we did get quite a few more questions, and we will try to answer those. If there are site-specific questions or questions that we need some additional information, we won't be able to take those today, but Roy did provide a link to where you can find EPA regional contacts in your area, or you can contact Roy or I for EPA Region 1 if we didn't get to one of your site-specific questions. Okay, so Melanie, the NESHAP is required to be reviewed every 8 years. Are the NSPS rules, the subparts 4I and 4J, scheduled to be reviewed?
I believe that, yes, we are required to review them, but we are not currently working on a review, so, that's not something that's in the near horizon.
Okay, thank you. When EPA sets the emissions standards and the regulations, do you make sure that the manufacturer can hit the standards with existing technology?
Well, yes. I mean, it is based on demonstrated technology generally, so yes. Okay.
And do I need to take HAP emissions from laboratory hood exhaust into account to determine major or area source status?
My advice, I don't generally get included, and I don't have a lot of expertise. So my advice, if you have a site-specific question like that, and that determination would be to talk to your EPA regional office or your state or local air pollution control agency if they've been delegated the rule for that sort of question.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. I think that's a really good point. And I think that we can just say generally that for potential to emit, you need to look facility-wide at all of your emitting facilities, and you calculate your potential to emit based on facility-wide emissions and not just looking at your engines. But yes, that is a good recommendation that they talk the specifics with their EPA regional contact. Can you confirm that a performance test is required for an uncertified engine if it is subject to a numeric emission limit?
Yes. Well, I mean, when you say uncertified, I'm assuming that means you're talking about new engines, and yes, I mean, they generally are, the test is required.
Okay, thanks. And again, I mean, it would be helpful to have more specific information on the year and the type of engine, and then it gets easier to look at the standard and what the testing requirements are. So.
Right, yeah.
If there are no HAP emissions in the permit, some would consider that this would not be covered by the NESHAP at all. Could this be an area source anyways?
Yes. I mean, if you have a stationary engine, even if that's the only HAP emission source at the facility, then you're going to be an area source.
Right. Engines emit hazardous air pollutants, so.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. There was a question about the combined heat and power portion of this webinar and how this is useful for combined heat and power. So I don't know if someone wants to try to answer that. I think the point is that we're trying to point out that an engine is part of a combined heat and power application, and therefore it would have these engine rule requirements. Which is why we went through the requirements of the engine rules.
I guess this is Roy. I'll just say Gary would certainly be able to tell you there is lots and lots of information on the Combined Heat and Power website on the benefits of combined heat and power, economic analyses, how to determine whether it will work for you, and so on. And they have done a regular series of webinars and put information out there. This webinar really was focusing on one specific aspect, the relationship of combined heat and power to these engine regulations. So that's why we're not going in depth into all the aspects of where combined heat and power works. It's a good technology. The economics are going to be site-specific. The CHP partnership can give you lots of help in getting at that.
Okay, thanks, Roy. Melanie, do you know, is the use of an emergency engine when there is a reduction in power supply, but before a blackout, still considered to be emergency?
I think we would need more specifics in order to answer that type of question.
Okay. Thanks. Will uncertified spark ignition emergency engines be subject to the stack test requirements?
Yes. So the stack test requirements in the spark ignition engine and SPS are not limited to non-emergency engines. They also apply to emergency engines.
Okay, thanks. I think that's helpful. Well, I do think we've actually come to the end of our questions. There are some questions about potential to emit, but those can be difficult to answer, and like you said, are better answered as a site-specific. So we provided you with the contact information for how to reach EPA contacts in other regions of the country, and Melanie's contact information, and Roy and I.
Yeah, we could take a few minutes and show you some of those websites since we have a little bit of time. Sarah, are you able to, if I give you a URL, are you able to bring that up and I can just show them?
Sure.
If you go to my presentations, there's a live link at slide slide 18, information sources on your EPA compliance requirements. There's always the technology to be considered on this, and we appreciate you bearing with us on this. Our screen froze here. So
I'm sorry, what slide is it?
Slide 18, which says information sources on your EPA compliance requirements. There is a live link to epa.gov/region1/RICE in the first bullet.
Okay. Okay. We're showing the screen, the web page. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, as you see here, and we're going to diminish this so I can see it, we've got the little picture of the engine here. We have a column on the left-hand side that has basic headings. and kind of a plain language description. The boxes on the right, if you scroll down to the box that says Tools to Help You Comply, you'll see on there a link to the Rice NESHAP homepage. And before we go there, I'll just show you we have several PowerPoints listed there. A little further down, we have the forms that you can use for initial notification. So it's the sample initial notification form about halfway down. We have the notification of compliance status. So it's an area where we'll post new things. Up at the very top, we have a box for training things, and it's very likely we will have a couple more webinars, that is, on the RICE requirements, maybe sometime in July or August, so you can look at that box. If you go midway through the Tools to Help You Comply and you see that link for Rice NESHAP homepage, why don't you click on that one, Sarah, and that will bring you to the national site. You see here there are 4 tabs up at the top. One of them is Federal Register notices. So I said everything that's useful there is listed, and all the whole regulatory history. There's a lot of information under the implementation info box. So if you click on that, and she's in the Federal Register notices, so you'll see all the actions are listed there. We're back to implementation information. At the very top, you see that box on the right that says Regional Contacts with the green top. That's where you get all the people to contact in all of the 10 EPA regions with phone number and email address. And if you go down on this page a little bit more, you'll see where the RegNav tool is listed. Yeah, you can also click to it from the top of the page, but in the middle there is the RegNav tool. The first one is the one that we looked at. The second one is the one for the NSPS standards, and it has a similar structure. And then we have example forms and a lot of other things. Melanie has done some really great Q&A documents. Melanie, you want to chime in and point out where that one is? This is well, we're seeing it right here: implementation questions and answers, how to avoid common testing errors, and then that guidance on the NAICS codes for who's residential, commercial, and institutional is also right there at that same spot. So a wealth of useful information there. So with that, I think that gives you an idea of the websites and what they can be used for. Susan, are there any other questions that have come up?
You know, Melanie, there were 2 other questions that did come in that we should try and take, and one was a prior question. Under the NSPS, what constitutes a major repair or maintenance regarding having to reconduct a performance test?
Yeah, I think we do refer to a definition that's in the reg text. I don't have it right in front of me, but I think that there is a definition.
Yeah.
Yeah, we say well we say a rebuilt stationary engine means an engine that has been rebuilt, as that term is defined in 40 CFR 9411A.
Okay, and there is a section in the rule that elaborates a little bit more on that as well. So we could provide the citation to that section.
Right.
Okay. And then under the new source performance standards, if a facility is using a non-certified engine and it needs to conduct a stack test, when is the stack test due?
The time frame. I think it's specified in the general provisions of Part 60, and
okay.
I don't have it right in front of me, but
okay, so I can just say generally under the general provisions, it's 60 days from when the engine achieves maximum production, or 180 days. So it would be one of those 2.
Right.
So I think that was it for questions. And we were able to get through the website. So
maybe we'll go back to Gary now for Gary McNeil for our wrap up. Gary, are you
Great.
there?
Yeah, thank you, Roy, and thank you for the great plug for the CHP partnership. And thank you, Melanie, Roy, and Susan for taking us through some pretty complicated material, pretty smoothly. And just a quick reminder, the webinar slides and the recording, the webinar presentations and the log will be available, and the slides will be available next week, and the recording will be available tomorrow morning. So I invite you to look at those. And I think with that, signing off, and thank you to all everyone in the audience for joining us today. Goodbye.